My sick grandmother is able to talk again, using AI. She's saying unspeakable things. I'll never forget the night before my mom passed away. The entire family, mom, dad, grandma, my much younger 8-year-old brother Brian, and myself, had all gathered around the dinner table to celebrate the holidays, joking and laughing as we ate Grandma's famous cookies before heading to bed for the night. The next morning, Mom was gone. Brian took it the hardest. With my dad always at work and me being off at college, my brother naturally turned to the only family member who was home to support him, Grandma. She'd bake him her famous cookies, play games with him in the backyard, and read him bedtime stories at night. And as a result, somehow, in the wake of Mom's death, Brian got better and returned to his happy and joyous self, basking in his time with his new, albeit older, parental figure. But just a year later, Grandma had a stroke, leaving her conscious but paralyzed in a wheelchair, unable to speak and barely able to move. Brian was once again inconsolable, sitting by Grandma's side in silence by day and crying himself to sleep at night. Sure, he had been profoundly hurt by the loss of our mother just a year prior, but losing Grandma, or at least the Grandma we knew, was somehow even worse. She was there, but not there at the same time, causing him to cling on to her in a way he simply hadn't with Mom. Seeking to fill the void of Brian's attachment with Grandma, Dad and I tried everything, from hiring a nanny to watch over him while we were away, to me even putting a pause on college for a while to be home with him. But no matter what we did, nothing worked. Day by day, he simply hung his head in sadness, sitting by Grandma's side and refusing to speak, as if in solidarity. Until one day, I read an article about an AI company specializing in a conversational experience designed to emulate that of a lost family member or lover. The concept was simple. Provide the company with as much information about the loved one as possible, and they create a chatbot custom-tailored to recreate their personality, capable of responding, engaging, and asking questions in the exact tone, style, and personality of said loved one. In our case, Grandma. Sure, it wasn't quite meant for someone like Grandma who hadn't actually passed away, but we were desperate to try anything to get Brian back to normal. So we mailed the company every recipe Grandma had ever come up with, every letter she had ever written, and every story she had ever told us, and waited. And sure enough, a couple weeks later, we received a confirmation email from the company. Congratulations, Grandma's chatbot is ready. Together, as a family, Brian, Dad, and myself, along with Grandma in her wheelchair, signed into the chatbot on a tablet, placed it in Grandma's lap, and began talking with her. And sure enough, she came alive again. Hey, Grandma, how old were you when you gave birth to Dad? I asked. 29? The chatbot replied, in an eerily perfect recreation of Grandma's voice. Hey, Grandma, what's your favorite movie? My dad asked, attempting a trick question. I hate movies, the chatbot replied, just as Grandma used to do. We all let out a laugh, including Brian, who, after previously being a bit hesitant, quietly walked up to Grandma and asked his own question. Hey, Grandma, what's the secret to your cookie recipe? Nutmeg and a sprinkle of sea salt. She replied again just as she always had. It brought a smile to Brian's face, causing Dad and myself to practically shed a tear. Brian continued to ask questions, and in just a week's time, my poor brother, who had been driven into depression after 2 back-to-back losses, had bounced back, once again returning to his happy self. It was as if Grandma was back, her relationship with Brian returning to business as usual, as she taught him how to bake her famous cookie recipe himself, talked to him while he played in the backyard, and read him bedtime stories at night. All through the voice of the chatbot, of course, while Grandma herself sat there in silence, enjoying Brian's return to normalcy, or so we hoped. But I couldn't help but feel a bit skeptical of the situation as we watched Grandma sitting there, an AI voice speaking on her behalf, while she herself, unable to speak, simply looked at us, her eyes moving around in silence. I couldn't help but wonder what she was actually thinking. But despite my hesitation, my dad insisted that everything was okay and, feeling a pressure to return to work and school respectively, my dad and I were left with no choice but to leave Brian home with Grandma, at least during the day. And for a while, all was well. Until months later, when it came time for us to go on our yearly family camping trip. Sure, our numbers had dwindled, but with the introduction of Grandma's chatbot, we had regained one more family member. So the four of us, Dad, Brian, Grandma, and I, set off in our camper and headed upstate for what was to be a week of relaxation, at the same spot by the river we always camped at. It had been a family tradition, going all the way back to my dad's youth, and was complete with a fire pit, treehouse, and old cabin. For the first couple days, things were normal, as Grandma's chatbot filled the silence of Grandma's stroke, as she cheered Brian on as he baked her famous cookie recipe by the fire, called up to him while he played in the treehouse, and read him bedtime stories at night in the old cabin. But on the third day, something changed. When Dad and I got back from playing baseball by the river, we found Brian sitting by the fire pit, staring at a charred batch of cookies that were burning in the fire. "What happened here, bud?" my dad casually asked Brian. "Grandma told me to destroy them." "Why?" I asked. "Because she said I didn't cook them right." Dad and I didn't quite know what to make of it, so we simply both let out a nervous laugh. "She always was picky," my dad reasoned jokingly as he walked away. Later that day, while Brian was hanging out in the old treehouse, Grandma sitting there in her wheelchair below, I realized he had gone uncharacteristically quiet and decided to climb up its wooden ladder to investigate. Upon discovering my brother carving words into the walls of the treehouse, I asked, "What you writing, bud?" But he didn't reply. He simply kept scratching away at its wooden walls with a rock. Again, I didn't quite know what to make of the bizarre behavior, so I simply ignored it. And then later that night, I overheard the weirdest thing yet. As Grandma's chatbot read Brian a bedtime story in the old cabin, I heard her read some of the sentences backwards. "That's odd," I whispered to myself, confused by the creepy-sounding rendition of the story. But the creepiest thing about it was the fact that Grandma herself lay asleep in her wheelchair as her AI voice read on. I thought to interrupt and let Brian know that something might be wrong with the chatbot's software, but he had already fallen asleep and looked so content in his slumbers that I decided to leave it alone and went to bed. The next day, things escalated. In the morning, we found Brian once again sitting by the fire, this time cooking something else in the fire. "That's no cookie," my dad said to me, his nose twitching, before we both ran over to inspect what my brother was roasting. Lo and behold, there was a burnt squirrel cooking away on a stick as Brian stared deep into the fire. But before we could say anything, my brother picked up the charred creature and began eating it as though it was a piece of corn on the cob. "Brian, what are you doing?" my dad yelled. My brother simply turned to him and said, "Having breakfast." "Why are you eating that of all things?" I asked in disgust. "Grandma told me to," he said, taking a bite, before my dad ripped it out of his hand. "Brian!" my dad and I cried out, scolding him in unison. We both looked over at Grandma, who simply stared back at us with wide eyes, before we turned our gaze to the tablet that was sitting on her lap. "Hey, Grandma, why'd you tell Brian to eat a squirrel?" I called out to the device. "Because it deserved it," the chatbot replied in Grandma's voice. "Maybe it's time we power off Grandma," my dad suggested, as he attempted to reach for the tablet, but Brian hissed at us and snatched the device from Grandma's lap before Dad could grab it, more attached to Grandma than ever. Later that day, as my dad and I discussed whether we should turn off the chatbot for the rest of the trip, we were interrupted by yet another burning smell. This time, that of candles. We looked at each other, confused, before we raced to the source of the smell. The treehouse, where Grandma was once again sitting at its base. Upon climbing up to the treehouse, we found Brian sitting there in silence, his head down, holding a lit candle in each of his hands, the words he had carved into the tree littering its walls like a bizarre wallpaper. "What's wrong, Brian?" my dad asked. "Oh, nothing's wrong," he replied. "I'm just holding a service for Grandpa." But Grandpa already had a service when he passed away years back. "I know, but Grandma wasn't there for it." "Yeah, she was Bud. Remember? She was sitting beside you." "Yeah, but Grandma wasn't," he said, pointing down to the tablet in Grandma's lap, where the chatbot remained silent. "Hey, Grandma," Dad called down to the device. "Did you tell Brian to hold this service for Grandpa?" "Yes." The tablet's speaker called out in Grandma's voice. "Grandpa's soul is restless and asked for a sacrifice." "A sacrifice?" I asked aloud, as my dad and I turned to each other, then back to the treehouse. That's when we saw it. A mangled bird, surrounded by more lit candles, its feathers scattered everywhere. My dad and I looked at each other in horror. "Yeah, okay, no more chatbot," my dad said, before racing back down the ladder, running over to Grandma and ripping the tablet from her lap before Brian could even think to stop him. "Dad, stop!" he screamed down from the treehouse. "Leave Grandma alone. You're hurting her." But Dad ignored his pleas. "Get rid of that animal. Get down here and be on your best behavior, and I'll consider letting Grandma read you a bedtime story tonight." Brian did just that, returning to normal and spending the rest of the day with us, careful to be on his best behavior. That night, true to his word, Dad wheeled Grandma over to Brian's bed in the old cabin, where the tablet began to read him a bedtime story, before Dad retired to his own bed for the night. Meanwhile, I went for a walk by the river at night, where I would always go to look up at the stars. Until suddenly, I heard my dad let out a loud scream in the distance. It was a horrifying sound, the likes of which I'd never heard from him, causing me to immediately run back to the old cabin to investigate. When I got there, I found Brian in Dad's bedroom, standing over a now bleeding Dad, who was mumbling, "Help!" before his eyes rolled back in his head and he went unconscious. "Brian!" I screamed. Hearing my cry, my brother turned back to me, holding a baseball bat, the same one my dad had been bringing up to the camp since he was a boy. "Brian, what have you done?" I yelled out. "Grandma told me Mommy missed Daddy," he explained before continuing. "So I was helping return Daddy to Mommy." I looked over at the tablet, which was sitting on Grandma's lap, before it chimed in. "Brian, Mommy misses your brother too. Now that you've returned Daddy to her, it's time you do the same to your brother." "Yes, Grandma," my brainwashed brother replied almost robotically, as if he was somehow connected to the sinister device. I looked at Grandma as her eyes raced back and forth, clearly conscious of what was happening, but unable to move or speak. "Brian, no!" I called out, as he carried the baseball bat towards me. I took a step back, but before I could run away, I felt a pair of metal jaws clamp down on my leg, crunching the bone and trapping me there. "Ah!" I cried out in pain, as I looked down to discover a small metal animal trap that Brian must have left inside the old cabin for one of us. As I fell to the ground in pain, Brian walked closer and closer and closer, raising the baseball bat high above his head. Grandma's chatbot spoke again. "Do it, Brian! What are you waiting for? Kill him!" Brian took a look at the tablet in Grandma's lap, then back at me, before preparing to strike down on me with the bat as I lay there, helpless. But suddenly I saw something move behind my brother. It was Grandma herself, having somehow willed herself to stand up as she gripped onto the tablet. "Grandma!" I yelled out, shocked to see her standing. That's when Brian turned around to find Grandma holding the tablet high above her head, just as he had just done with his baseball bat. Knowing what she was about to do, Brian cried out, "No, Grandma, don't do it!" But it was too late. In a matter of seconds, Grandma had smashed the tablet to bits on the floor of the old cabin, its glass surface shattering into 1,000 pieces, its electronic innards spilling out everywhere. My brother watched on in horror as he screamed again. "No!" After Grandma finished destroying the device, having used every ounce of strength left in her body, she fell back into her wheelchair before saying 4 words. "Brian, I love you." My brother's face turned from a look of shock to one of utter happiness, and tears started rolling down his cheeks as he realized his real grandma was back and snapped out of his trance. He ran over to hug her. "Grandma, I'm so sorry. It told me to do bad things. I thought it was you." Grandma tried to reply but was too exhausted. She simply patted him on the back as he hugged her, crying. Meanwhile, I rushed over to my dad and attempted to mend his wounds before carrying him off to the camper and driving him to the hospital where he was treated for the next few weeks. Less than a month later, our family had gathered around the dinner table for the holidays, just as we always did. Grandma, having regained the ability to walk with a cane, sat by Brian and I at the table, while Dad, still recovering, sat beside us in the very same wheelchair that once belonged to Grandma. As we all finished eating, Dad turned to my brother and asked, "What's for dessert, Brian?" Brian shot Grandma a smile, who smiled back, and he ran to the kitchen, returning a minute later with a batch of her famous cookies. As we all sat there at the dinner table eating the cookies, a light snow could be seen through the windows falling outside, and it finally felt as if life had returned to normal. Dad and I were careful not to bring up the incident at the camping trip, lest it trigger something in my brother again, and managed to avoid the topic the entire night until we all grew tired. "I'm sleepy," Brian said as he stared at his phone. "I'm gonna go to bed." With that, he placed his phone on the dinner table and, forgetting it, headed upstairs to retire for the night. "Night, bud," my dad said with a smile. "Night, Brian," I added with a smile of my own. Dad and I both looked over at Grandma, who, instead of smiling along with us, had a concerned look on her face. "What is it, Grandma?" I asked. She waited a moment for Brian to disappear up the stairs before pointing to something. Dad and I followed the direction of her finger to Brian's phone, which was still lying there, unlocked on the dinner table, its display still glowing. I carefully reached across the table to pick it up, expecting to find a game or digital comic, but instead found the mobile version of Grandma's chatbot with several characters typed into the login page's password field, and an error message that read, "Wrong password. Too many sign-in attempts. Try again in 24 hours." My eyes opened wide in horror as I realized that Brian had been trying to access Grandma's chatbot again. Luckily, we had never given him the password. "What is it?" my dad asked, seeing my adverse reaction. I simply slid the phone over to him, passing it by Grandma, who clearly already knew what was going on. Dad took one look at the phone's screen before saying, "We better cancel the account." "I'll do it tomorrow," I assured him, after recalling the correct password and knowing that the sign-in lock wouldn't expire until then. My dad, Grandma, and I looked at each other before we all turned to the cookies and started to munch away on them nervously in silence, our minds all surely wondering if this was actually the end of Brian's allegiance to Grandma's AI chatbot, or only just the beginning.